Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 20 of my Whispers of the Old Gods card review. That's right, I've had 20 videos reviewing these cards, and guess what? This is the last one. I think we've got about 13 cards to wrap up the entire Whispers of the Old Gods set. So join me as we take a closer look at the last remaining cards. Starting off with Selfless Hero, a new Paladin minion at 1 mana. This is a 2/1 with a pretty interesting death rattle. Give a random friendly minion Divine Shield. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, Paladin's getting a lot of Divine Shield synergy cards like Rallying Blade, for instance, with Whispers of the Old Gods. And here's yet another one that really seems to support the early game rush style Divine Shield buff strategy that Paladin can employ. That's already doing it pretty successfully. That's probably going to go nuts in the new expansion. This card is all kinds of good to me. 1 mana 2/1 is what you want to see, particularly in aggressive decks anyway. And this death rattle lines up pretty nicely because typically you're always going to have at least a couple minions out. Even on turn 2 when this is likely to die, you might have a minion out. So this operates almost like a secret, like a 1 mana secret. For instance, Avenge, where when you kill something you're punished for doing so, which is a pretty tough thing in Paladin already. So you always have dilemmas and friction when killing minions, and this one just adds to that. And it's not that hard for opponents to play around because they can just kill this last sometimes. But most of the time you'll be able to control when this dies and what you can buff, so that gives you a lot of power. And it fits just so well in Paladin as I see it in the expansion. Damage to an undamaged character. So this is basically the super backstab. Has the same caveat as backstab that the character has to be undamaged. Now, I will note that this actually does say character and not minion. So apparently you can use this on the enemy hero when they're at full health, which probably doesn't matter most of the time unless perhaps you're running a Malagos deck that's all about finishing them off in one single turn. But anyway, Shadow Strike will mostly be used against minions, I think. A lot of stuff is very powerful at 5 health. In fact, most of the best minions in the game line up at 5 health. So this certainly hits the right number that Eviscerate doesn't hit, and I think that's probably why this card exists, because Eviscerate's very, very good, just because of the flexibility it has in hitting the face, hitting minions, combo or not comboed. So Shadow Strike for just a little bit more, you get 1 extra damage. But all that said, paying 1 mana for 1 damage over Eviscerate feels kind of bad, particularly when there's a condition that the character has to be undamaged. So this card's really limiting you, despite lining up nicely with health. I don't really see this getting played a lot. Just compare this to something like a Shadow Word Death from Priest, and you can see just how bad it is. There will very occasionally be moments where it's a slight tempo advantage. If you kill the Emperor Thaurissan, you're basically kind of gaining 3 mana over your opponent. But you're committing to this in your deck. Sometimes it'll feel bad to play it. It's just a little awkward and a little expensive compared to other stuff that Rogue has. I think I'd often rather just use a backstab and a deadly poison to kill the same 5 damage minion. So taking up valuable card slots here for a somewhat expensive spell just doesn't feel right to me. I don't think Shadow Strike's all that great. Moving on to a new mage spell at 2 mana called Shatter. This reads, destroy a frozen minion. So Shatter is essentially just hard removal. But, again, I don't know that this one is all that great, particularly because I don't know what kind of decks are going to run it. Now, Mage is getting a new card which freezes random characters when a spell is cast, so there's definitely some synergy with Shatter and that new card, just because potentially you could hard remove anything that card freezes. But the problem with Shatter to me is that when something is frozen, you're already gaining a tempo and initiative advantage. In other words, it's locked in place, it's not attacking, you're stalling. There's some reason you froze it in the first place. So very rarely do you need to kind of pile on with extra. In other words, destroying it. This is kind of the execute for freeze, whereas warrior has to deal damage and then executes it. Mage has to freeze and then destroy / execute it, or shatter it in this case. So it's basically always going to take 2 spells to use shatter, or at least some kind of minion attack that freezes too, which is not all that common. Which means it's kind of costly to use this. Even 2 mana is more expensive than execute. Mage already has a lot of ways to remove minions, like polymorph for instance. Yes, that's a little more expensive, but I just don't see a world where this is substantially better than polymorph, because you might have to frostbolt first anyway, so it's still 4 mana, destroy a minion, and you've wasted 2 cards instead of 1. I just don't see the deck that runs this. I don't think it's good in freeze. I don't think it's good in tempo. Maybe this will come out somewhere and be an amazing removal card, but I just don't see it right now. Moving on to a new neutral minion called the Silithid Swarmer. It's a 3 mana 3/5, and it can only attack if your hero attacked this turn. So this is essentially another card that you're getting a bonus of 1 health. Instead of being a 3 mana 3/4, you're getting 1 extra health, but there is a little bit of a downside. Can only attack if your hero attacked this turn. So many classes this is going to be totally unplayable because they either don't have weapons or hero power that allows them to attack. And even in weapon classes or druid that can attack, I really don't see this card ever being played. The upside is pretty small and the limitation is pretty harsh. Because if you could just get a really powerful 4 mana 3/5 or a normal 3 mana 3/4 in the same deck slot, and then you don't have a really rough condition that makes this card totally useless. Obviously you can combo it with stuff like taunt cards, but there are so many other just body cards that are good with Defender of Argus or Sun Fury Protector compared to this one that I just can't ever imagine a world where you'd run Silithid Swarmer instead of an alternative. Just looks like a really weak card to me. That's another token card, uncollectible. A few more uncollectible token cards. And then a new rogue card, the Southsea Squid Face. I like how even the parrot here seems to have tentacles instead of a beak. This is a 4 mana 4/4. It's a pirate, so we got some nice pirate synergies, and it has a death rattle. Give your weapon +2 attack. So this is another of many rogue cards that seems to follow the 4/4, or at least not rogue cards, but cards that rogues like to play that falls at the 4/4 stat allocation. So it seems to be fine there. For 4 mana, you're not really losing much, maybe 1 health. It does make it a little bit more susceptible and harder to trade with. But it has a nice death rattle upside. +2 attack on a weapon is quite valuable. That's basically a poison effect. So if you can get a deadly poison, that's essentially 1 mana in value. So you're kind of getting a 3 mana 4/4 in a sense in many ways, which is not too bad at all. It's still not overpowered. I think it's a balanced card. It could easily be played in pirate weapon decks. Has all the synergies. It just kind of has to be toyed with and see where it lines up. Could either be average, might even be good. I don't think it's overpowered. I don't think it's underpowered either. It feels just like a nicely balanced card to me. Another token minion, and then here we have a new neutral minion called Squirming Tentacle. It is a taunt at 3 mana, and it has 4 health and 2 attack. This is just kind of a straight up vanilla minion, a new taunt added to the game. This is not going to shake up the meta. It's probably not going to be played in competitive level decks, but it's a nice addition for beginners who need a taunt. It'll be a fine arena card as well. The stats, if it was a 3/4, it would certainly be insanely good. As a 2/4, it's just fine. There's really not much to say about Squirming Tentacle. I'm glad it's in the game, but won't be turning any heads anytime soon. So up next is a new shaman card called Stormcrack. At 2 mana, this spell will deal 4 damage to a minion, and it has an overload of 1. Not a great card in my mind. So essentially you're paying 3 mana for this card, and it does 4 damage to a minion. When I compare this to a card like Crackle, that used to exist in standard format, or like Rogue's Eviscerate, or really even a Frostbolt or a Dark Bomb, or so many other 2-mana damage spells. This one feels much weaker in my mind, because really it's a 3-mana spell, not a 2-mana spell, which is of course similar to Crackle. But Crackle could do between 3 and 6 damage, whereas this only does 4 damage, and specifically to a minion. So this doesn't have the flexibility of Crackle. Slightly more consistent, but also worse in some cases. In fact, worse half the time. So I just don't know where this card lives, or what decks play it, or who thinks it's great. 4 damage is also significantly worse than 5 damage. There's a fair amount of stuff with 4 health, but even more cards have 5 health. So you'll just whiff on this many times without some spell damage. If it was a deal 3 damage, overload 1, it would still be bad. I really don't know how to make this card better. It just feels like it lives in an awkward spot to me. So moving on to a new priest minion called the Twilight Darkmender. It's a 5-mana 6/5, which is a really pretty solid body for the 5-mana cost. It has a nice aggressive stance as well, which is cool. And a battle cry: if your Cthulhu has at least 10 attack, restore 10 health to your hero. So this is a pretty neatly designed card. Unlike the other priest card in the set, which restores 5 health to your hero, this one makes a little more sense to me. It's very clearly designed for Cthulhu decks, which want to play into the late game until they draw Cthulhu and are able to play Cthulhu for a really big damage effect to their opponent's board. So this is kind of the anti-Keelbot of that world, where as long as you've buffed your Cthulhu a couple times up to turn 5, or at least up until you play this card, it's going to heal 10 health to your hero. So it's even better than an anti-Keelbot heal. So this is the ultimate: I'm stabilizing the game, I'm pushing out aggro decks, I'm staying alive for a couple more turns, I'm also depositing a huge minion onto the board that trades effectively. So all those things allow you to stabilize and live until your Cthulhu turns arrive. And honestly, getting a Cthulhu to 10 attack is not hard at all. If you've seen all the Cthulhu cards that buff Cthulhu, they give +2/+2 just like crazy. Every card has buffs. So you could probably pretty reliably, if you're running a Cthulhu deck with all those buffs, you could get him to 10 attack by turn 5. And certainly even if you played this turn 8, turn 9, turn 10, you're most likely going to get the heal off. I can't imagine a world where you don't get the heal off, unless you run this in a sort of hybrid Cthulhu deck that only has a handful of Cthulhu cards. It would be a little awkward to do that. I don't know what Cthulhu decks are going to look like just yet. This card wouldn't be ran in that case, probably, because it has to have the health to be a very good card. So you'll need that consistency and the promise that the 10 health will arrive. But for Cthulhu decks, this card seems like a dream come true. It seems perfectly designed and incredibly strong. Moving on, this is actually a token minion that comes out of the new Shaman weapon, whose name I can't remember, so this is not a collectible card. But this one is. It is the new 2-mana neutral minion, Twilight Geomancer. It's a 2-mana 1/4 with Taunt, and has a battle cry: give your Cthulhu taunt wherever it is. This is an interesting card. Most of the Cthulhu synergy cards have involved buffs that make your Cthulhu's attack stronger, which is significant because when your Cthulhu is played, he has a battle cry that distributes his attack damage as pings to the enemy side of the board, so it can do 20 damage to the enemy board in 20 different pings if it has 20 attack. This one doesn't buff stats at all. It actually gives your Cthulhu taunt, which I guess is valuable with the implication that you're playing your Cthulhu didn't win you the game automatically, which I think it will in many cases, but instead you kind of need to hide behind the giant buffed body of your Cthulhu in order to survive the late game. That said, I don't really think that's going to be valuable. It's very hard to see without knowing what Cthulhu decks look like in real play. But I don't think your Cthulhu having taunt will matter. I think if it's a 30-30, you probably just won the game off the damage that it provided. If it's a 10-10, having it taunted probably doesn't make all that big of a difference anyway. And you're giving up a little bit with this card. As a 1/4, I think it's just a little too awkward and doesn't trade effectively. If this was a 2/3 with taunt, perhaps it would be slightly better. But I don't think this is a good minion on its own, and I don't think its battle cry is significant in Cthulhu decks. I think this will be one of the Cthulhu cards that's really just overlooked, and it really doesn't see play at all. Sorry, Twilight Geomancer. Up next is a pretty crazy new legendary that you'll know if you ever raided in World of Warcraft back in the good old days. This is Twin Emperor Vek'lor. It's a 7 mana 4/6 with taunt. So a 4/6 at 7 mana doesn't sound all that exciting, right? It's a solid stat allocation, but you'd really prefer paying something like 5 mana to get that. But the Twin Emperor here has a pretty nifty battle cry. If your Cthulhu has at least 10 attack, summon another Emperor. So as I mentioned before, it's really not that hard to get your Cthulhu to 10 attack in my mind, particularly by turn 7. So I think this is going to go off 100% of the time unless you really mess something up in the early game. And the other Emperor that it summons is right here. It's the Twin Emperor Vek'lor, and it's also a 4/6 minion with taunt. So essentially when this hits, for 7 mana, you're getting 2 4/6 taunts, or a total of 8/12 in stats for 7 mana. Super good. Very difficult for opponents to deal with. You're loading up the board with 2 super strong minions. It's a dream play versus aggressive decks if you live to turn 7, which is fantastic when you want to survive to your Cthulhu turn later in the game. It's great in control matchups as well because it's just 2 giant bodies, and that's always a good thing to have. And their taunts as well, so it can really disrupt your opponent's plans and their board. This card is just really, really cool and fun to see. And I love cards like this that just load up the board with taunts. I'm a big taunt fan, so I can't wait to see these 2 in action. I think they're going to be fantastic and an instant inclusion in any Cthulhu deck that's worth its weight. So, Twin Emperor Vek'lor, pretty awesome card. Remember, this one is actually not collectible. This is created only by this one. So as long as you have Vek'lor, you can pull this off. This is just played on the board as an effect of the battle cry. So moving on to another neutral minion. This time it's a common Twisted Worgen at 2 mana. This is a 3/1 with stealth. So this looks a lot like the other Worgen at 1 mana, but this is actually a pretty interesting little card. I think that this has the potential to be played. In many ways, this is probably going to be a guaranteed 3 damage attack, whether you want that to happen on the enemy's face or clearing a minion. I think it's very likely to survive on turn 2. I'm not saying it's great in a competitive world, but it's probably decent in arena. And maybe some competitive decks that are looking for damage could run it as well. It does lack like beast synergies, which would be nice, but I don't think this is a bad card. I think it could easily see some play here and there. Moving on to a new 5 mana Warlock minion called Usher of Souls. This is a 5/6 body, which is really quite good for 5 mana. That's really the ideal stat allocation, in fact, just because it trades into other 5 attack stuff pretty effectively. And it has a neat effect as well. Whenever a friendly minion dies, give your Cthulhu +1/+1. That's great because, of course, you want a big Cthulhu. The more powerful your Cthulhu is, the more likely it's just going to instantly win you the game, and the better off you're going to be. So if you get like 1 or 2 or 3 even buffs out of this card, you feel pretty good. And since it has a great stat allocation, you don't feel bad playing it anyway, just because it trades really effectively. So it seems like this card's all upside to me, especially in a class like Warlock, where you typically have a lot of little minions on the board. You're trading up with things like Abusive Sergeant or Power Overwhelming. There are a lot of favorable ways to kill minions in Warlock, so you're not really punishing yourself in order to receive the buffs. So between all the other buffing Cthulhu cards and Usher of Souls, you're very likely to get off some 20 plus damage Cthulhu battle cries. Again, I don't know what Cthulhu decks are going to look like, but it seems like this would be an instant inclusion to me. The card is strong and really doesn't have any downsides at all. Token card, some more token cards, and I think this is the final card in my Whispers of the Old Gods card review. If you can't tell, I'm getting a little tired and a little burned out discussing these. I can't wait to see them in action, but it's a lot of hard work reviewing these, so I'm happy that it's over. This is the 1 mana Zealous Initiate. It's a 1/1, and as a death rattle, give a random friendly minion +1/+1. So this card has a cool design. I like to see death rattles, but I really do think it's overall pretty weak. So if everything goes exactly perfectly with this card, you end up getting a total of 2/2 in stats for 1 mana, which is okay. Most cards have 2/1 with a positive effect, so this is slightly better than that. And having only 1 attack at its base, it really doesn't challenge the board in the first turn, so it could just die very easily for free or trade poorly into opposing minions the following turn. So there's no real incentive to kill this and buff your turn 2 card, because you're probably going to just run it into something and it will die for free. So it will basically be a 0/0 and you'll buff something +1/+1, which doesn't always matter. I think probably this card is intentionally a little bit weaker just to balance out the death rattle curve of quality, so that occasionally you'll hit some death rattle, some bum draws with discover death rattle effects and random death rattle draws. Because without it, otherwise death rattle cards might just be too good. So I'm sad to say the last card of my Whispers of the Old Gods card review might actually be the worst card that we've seen yet. So sorry to say that, Zealous Initiate. But that'll wrap it up for part 20 of my review, and that will wrap it up for my review altogether. If you have any thoughts or questions about these cards, or really any of the cards so far, of course, feel free to leave them in the comments. I really appreciate you coming all this way with me and listening to me rattle on about all these cards. Much love for the patience. So thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.